Another example of this type of real externality is the selection distortion that we talked about last Friday, right? So we studied the comparison between free entry and average cost pricing. Now I want to put this into an oligopoly model. So let's suppose that each firm gets a representative sample of the population, right? That's just the natural extension of our symmetry assumption from before, right? So that however many people are served, every firm's going to charge the same price, going to get the same fraction of the population. So then firms' profits are going to be the price, which depends on quantity, times the quantity, minus the, this should be quantity divided by n, QI, times the average cost of covering all the people who are willing to be in the market at the current price, right? So we can then define the average cost as just being the average cost among people who are in the market, right? And we can define the marginal cost as the average cost of people who are just on the margin. So this is starting to look a little bit more like some of the things we've been talking about, right? So what's the first order condition? Let me just see. What's the first order condition? Well, firms, just as they internalized a weighted average of marginal revenue and demand, right, are going to internalize a weighted average of marginal cost and average cost. They're going to put a weight theta on marginal cost, because if they were a monopoly, theta would be equal to 1, so they'd fully internalize marginal cost. If theta were equal to 0 and we had perfect competition, they would internalize average cost. So this will be the market equilibrium under oligopoly, right? So you do a weighted average of demand and marginal revenue, and a weighted average of average cost and marginal cost. Okay, so what is going to be the optimal market structure under adverse selection? Can anyone see? We talked about this a little bit before. What's the optimal market structure under adverse selection? If we have marginal cost that's less than average cost. Yeah. What? Competition, right? How about with advantageous selection? What's going to be the optimal market structure? Well, so which exact theta is it going to be? I'll let you guys do it at home, but it turns out the optimal theta is marginal cost minus average cost over marginal surplus, the difference between demand and marginal revenue, plus marginal cost minus average cost. So what that says is that sort of the fraction of oligopoly you want is the fraction of marginal cost minus average cost in the sum marginal cost minus average cost plus demand minus marginal revenue. Right? So there's like a distortion from monopoly, demand minus marginal revenue, a distortion from competition, marginal cost versus average cost. The oligopoly wants to be exactly at the point which is the fraction of the distortion from competition in the distortion from competition plus the distortion from monopoly. Does that make sense? Okay. So a way to think about that graphically is so if we have demand and marginal revenue, and then we have average cost and marginal cost, competition puts us here, monopoly puts us here, the optimum is here. How do we get there? Well, if we have oligopoly, remember, we're going to have a sort of marginal revenue curve that's somewhere in between. But we'll also have a cost curve that's somewhere in between. And we want to choose that in-betweenness so that we exactly get to the right point that matches the social optimum. Okay, so now I want to talk about distortions of product design, right? So let's imagine that we go back to the model of product design we were talking about before. But now we talk about having different, symmetric competition among firms a la Bertrand. So that means that the firms are going to choose their rho and their p, taking as given the rho and the p of the other firms, so as to maximize their profits, and they're going to come to a symmetric equilibrium. And what do I mean by symmetry here? Well, the distribution of utility that everyone's going to get, conditional on the firms choosing the same level of p and rho, is going to have the same distribution. That is, for everyone who likes product A over product B, there will be an equal and opposite person who likes product B over product A. And the costs of the firms for serving any individual will be the same as long as the level of rho is the same. Okay. Now, there are going to be two switch margins in this type of a market, right? There's going to be some people who are indifferent between switching between the two firms, and other people who are indifferent between being in one firm and exiting the industry. So imagine here's the utility that I get from firm 1, utility 1. Here's the utility I get from firm 2. People who have utilities down here are not going to buy either product, right? People who have utilities along up here are going to buy product 1. People who have utilities over here will buy product 2. And this will be the switching margin. People are indifferent between buying product 1 and product 2, but are definitely going to buy one product. This is going to be the exiting margin. People who are indifferent between buying no product or product 1 for firm 1, and this will be the exiting margin for product 2, right? Or you can call them the expansion margins. Now, I'm going to call the size of these two margins, the density of people along them, MS and MX, right? And just make sure this thing's on. By symmetry, we can think of choosing the social optimum as just taking the two firms' products and reducing the price or the level of coverage of each one of them, of the two of them together. Because we're only going to look for symmetric optima, we can just think of them sort of as being one product, and everyone just buys whichever one they prefer, right? So in that case, from the social perspective, there's really just this one product. Being in the market or out of the market, everyone chooses the one they prefer. And so the social optimum is just the conditions that we had before for the optimum applied to only the exiting margin. Because from society's perspective, it doesn't really matter whether you're in firm A or B. It's just whether you're in the market or out of the market. You should choose whichever one you prefer. So again, remember that was that we set the number of people times the expectation of their marginal utility minus their marginal cost equal to this sorting term that we had from before. The number of people along the margin times the covariance between the marginal utility and cost conditional on being on the exiting margin, right? Now, competition, on the other hand, has each firm doing what's profit maximizing against their residual demand curve. And for them, the residual demand curve is the people who are on the switching margin plus people who are on the exiting margin, right? So the optimum for them is going to set the number of people times the expectation of U prime along their marginal consumers. Their marginal consumers are both the exiting margin and the switching margin, right? So that's the Spence term minus the average cost of providing the good to the people, right, is equal to the sorting term along both the exiting and the switching margin, which is the sum of the number of people along the exiting margin times the covariance among them, plus the number of people along the switching margin times the covariance among them. So we have both a Spence distortion here, which if people get a representative sample of people in the market, the people who are just indifferent between switching between the two firms but are in the market are basically going to be representative of the people in the market as a whole. Now, that doesn't always have to be the case. Remember about the hoteling model we talked about. The people who are switching between the two firms were not representative of the people. But if the people who are switching are representative, then the Spence distortion is going to get less bad as more people are switching. The more people are switching, the greater this expectation is going to be basically just like an average along the switching margin. And if the switching people are representative, this term is going to be very similar to just the expectation of the utility, right? So at least in that case, the Spence distortion is going to get better with competition. But what about this term over here? This is the number of people along the switching margin times the covariance between the marginal utility of people on the switching margin for the product characteristic and the cost of those people. What this says is that if the people who like the quality are the most costly people, you're going to lower the quality. If the people who like the quality are the least costly people, you're going to raise the quality along the switching margin. But that doesn't show up in the social planners, in the government's optimal thing. Why is that? Because the government doesn't care that you get to steal all the best people from the other firm. But you do, right? And that's a distortion. You want to steal or cream skim all of the best customers, but but the government or the society doesn't care about that. So this is a distortion that comes not from monopoly, but from competition. Because this all depends on how many people are on the switching margin. The more people that are willing to switch between the two products, the more competitive the firms are, right? The more people that are willing to switch, that's going to drive down people, that's going to drive up the elasticity of demand. Because if I raise prices, a lot of people are going to switch over to the other firm. But here, competition is causing a distortion rather than rectifying a distortion, right? And in fact, as the number of people who are switching goes to infinity, as we get towards perfect competition, as everyone is willing to switch between the two goods, this is going to go to infinity. And that's going to mean that there's not going to be any way to satisfy this first order condition. And equilibrium is not going to exist. And this is a famous result of Rothschild and Stiglitz. What they said often happens in insurance is that if I can just offer a little bit lower coverage and a little bit lower price, the sick people are not going to like that as much. The healthy people will like that. I'll get all the healthy people. You'll get all the sick people. And that's going to make it impossible for us to sustain an equilibrium as we get towards perfect competition. So when you have these issues of consumers being of different value and these non-price dimensions, it's going to be very important to avoid perfect competition because that can cause the whole value of the product to disappear. Okay. Now, in some contexts, I think this distortion is really important. It can erode coverage of an insurance market as people try to get rid of the sick people. It can lead to inefficient hazing in the workplace. So you might, in the workplace, make the job painful or difficult or dangerous just so that you can attract the people who are willing to put up with all of that, who may be the most productive workers, right? I think that this is probably true in the financial industry. So firms make people work very long hours because they want to get from their competitors the people who are the most hardcore. It's a potential reason for workplace regulation. One justification you could give for why we have like maximum hours worked, workplace conditions, is that otherwise firms would use these non-price dimensions of the workplace to skim off the most valuable customers, and that workplace regulations stop them from doing that distortion. But I don't think anyone's ever measured this despite all the interest there is in workplace regulation. Another example of this is informational racing in financial markets. So firms often put a lot of effort into trying to figure out which stocks to buy. But to the extent that they're just taking those stocks away from someone else who's trying to figure it out and not really adding new information to the market, just getting those stocks for themselves rather than for someone else a minute ahead, they're just reducing the profits of other firms, and that's inefficient. So probably the most egregious example of this is that there was recently a tunnel built for almost $200 million between New York and Chicago. Why would you need a tunnel between New York and Chicago? For cars to travel? No. They wanted to put a fiber line between the cities so that they could say exactly what the price of Microsoft stock was in New York to the people in Chicago and vice versa, just tiny bit faster than was possible by going over the surface of the Earth. Because if you go over the surface of the Earth, it's a little bit longer, right? If you go through the Earth, it's a little bit shorter. So it turns out you can shave off about 4 milliseconds off the transit time of information by doing that. What does that let you do? It lets you be 4 milliseconds ahead of the market and make a ton of pennies off of arbitraging the difference in prices between the two markets. So that seems like complete waste. Like, what social purpose does that serve, right? Like, there's no benefit to knowing that the price was 1 cent higher or 1 cent lower a second 4 milliseconds earlier. Because no one has any time to do anything with that information. The only thing it does is make profits for these people, lets them skim the cream off of other people's portfolios. Another example of this comes from price discrimination when there's competition. So we talked about price discrimination when there was monopoly. When there's competition, price discrimination is a little bit different. So we said when we talked about price discrimination that there tends to be subsidies for students and subsidies for elderly people, right? Now, do we think that's because elderly people or students are, in the absence of that subsidy, more likely just not to go to the movie? Well, probably not. It's probably that they'll go look for another movie theater to go to. And so you want to try to compete for that market because you know those people can go and shop around to all the movie theaters and will go to the cheapest one. Whereas people with a family, older people, they don't care. People in middle age, they'll just go to whatever's most convenient to them. So what that says is that maybe the purpose of these price discrimination is not to get people to consume movies overall. Maybe it's just to get them to go to your movie theater rather than someone else's movie theater. And if that's the case, it's basically just cream skimming. It's that you're targeting benefits just to take them away from the other firm, right? And that is not nearly as beneficial, at least potentially, as price discrimination is. Because it's just a way of stealing from the other firm, not a way of actually improving the allocation. OK. So I hope I've convinced you that competition maybe isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Maybe it's not quite as great as everything that you've heard. But I want to now return to a world where competition is great. Because that's the world on which most competition policy is based. Even though maybe it shouldn't be. So let's think about the Cournot model. Now remember that in the Cournot model, as n goes, theta is equal to 1 over n. So as n goes to infinity, theta goes to 0. So what that says is that the markup of price over cost has to go to 0, unless the elasticity goes to 0. So as long as the elasticity is bounded above 0, price equals marginal cost as the number of firms gets large. So this is a very, very famous result. It's called Cournot's theorem. Probably the most important result in industrial organization. It says as the number of competing firms grows arbitrarily large, price converges to marginal cost. It's the foundation result, in fact, of perfect competition. So the reason why we say that a firm that's competing doesn't care about what the price is, just takes the price as given, right, is that if a firm is a small part of a large industry, it will effectively act as if it takes the price as given, right? It's also the basis of most antitrust and competition policy. The idea is that if we can get there to be lots of firms, prices will go down to cost and we'll get an efficient outcome. We've just seen that that's not necessarily the case, but that's the standard model that inspires all competition policy. Now, of course, when we don't have Cournot competition, when we have other forms of competition, again, there will be cases when theta goes to 0. And when theta goes to 0, those will be when you get a result that's like Cournot's theorem, right? So, for example, in differentiated Bertrand competition, it will be when the goods become very substitutable. It's when every sale that I make goes to someone else that I'm competing with. When the diversion ratio goes to 1, right? Another version is with a distribution of costs. So that could represent Bertrand competition. It's also, as I said, the same as a first price auction. So the optimal price for you to set is to set a price equal to the cost of the second highest person, conditional on the highest person's cost, the lowest person's cost being yours. You basically guess the bid of the next person, And so that means that as the number of firms gets large, the lowest cost firm will have a cost very close to the second lowest cost firm. And so this will be very close to the cost of the lowest cost firm. And so price converges to marginal cost, right? So again, in that case, the version of theta going to 0 will again be the number of firms getting large. OK. So again, with this form of Bertrand competition, as the number of firms grows large, or as the firms become very substitutable, we get to marginal cost pricing. OK. So in different models, in many different cases, there's always some analog of this result. That as something happens, as the number of firms get larger, as the products get very substitutable, we get towards perfect competition. So this is sort of a general rule about competition. Competition tends to drive prices down to marginal cost, or if there's some fixed costs which make it impossible to drive it down to marginal cost, to average cost, like we talked about before. OK. So this says that with enough firms, price should be efficient. So a natural question is how many firms is going to be enough? Now, Bresnahan and Race came up with a very clever way to study this question. So what they said is that as a market gets larger, the market can support more firms, right? Because when a market is very small, there's just not enough firms to employ all the people there, right? If you're moving to a small town, there's not going to be 100 doctors there, right? Because it can really only support one doctor, right? So let's call the number of people that it takes to support a number of firms, capital S, the number n, right? So S sub n will be the number of people it takes to support n firms. So let's call little s sub n the number of people per firm that it takes to support n firms when there are, the number of people per firm that it takes to support n firms. So that's capital S sub n over n, right? So this is the number of people that each firm has as a function of the number of firms there are. Now imagine that prices stayed the same as the number of firms increased. And the fixed costs were all the same for all people in the market. Then this number would be constant in n, right? It's going to take 100 people to support the first doctor, 200 people to have 2 doctors, 300 to have 3, etc. That would be true if the prices stayed completely the same as the number of people increased, right? But on the other hand, if prices fall as the number of firms increase, if competition brings down prices, then we should expect to require more people to get the second person to come into the market than to get the first person to come into the market. Why? Because people are going to be making less profits per person, so there will need to be more people in order to support the second person than to support the first one. So we should expect S3 to be less than S2 and less than S1. Right? Or more. Should be more? Yes. S3, sorry, should be greater than S2 and greater than S1. The number of people per firm that you need is going to be greater when there are more firms than if there are less firms, right? Now, of course, there could be other reasons why S3 is not equal to S2. Like there could be heterogeneity. There could be one person who knows that they want to be the doctor in this town and is willing to come even if they don't make much money. And then other people who are willing to be attracted if necessary. But for the moment, let's just stick with this assumption. I think it's a pretty smart first pass way to think about these things. So here's what they did. They found 5 professions in rural towns in the United States. And they said, how many people are there in each town? And how many people are there in this profession? That is, when does S start to level out? We would expect that S would sort of level out at some point, right? Which would show that we were converging to the level of perfect competition, right? If S continues to increase, that means that prices are continuing to fall. At some point, they'll stop, and we will have reached perfect competition. And they found that in most towns this happened, and in most professions, around 3 to 5 professionals. So this is S5 divided by Sn. So if Sn gets larger, this is going to get smaller, right? So this says, as we converge to perfect competition, rather than continuing to fall, this should get flat. And here's what you find. Initially, when you just have one person, this number is very high. But then it gets lower and lower, but it doesn't get much lower once you get past 3 people. So it gets pretty constant then. So what they interpret this as is that, look, we have all this debate. Bertrand says that you only need, Bertrand with common costs says that you only need 1 firm to get to perfect competition, 2 firms to get to perfect competition. Cournot says that it will happen very gradually. This is saying it's somewhere in between the two of these. That, somewhere between 3 and 5 firms, you're basically getting all the benefit you're getting out of competition. So that was a pretty interesting finding. Okay. So this theory and these empirical findings about the way that competition helps us to get to efficiency are the basis of what's called competition policy, which tries to make sure that markets are competitive enough. We're going to talk a bunch more about this in the rest of the lecture, but let me first just talk about some of the pros and cons of competition policy. So one major pro of competition policy, in addition to keeping prices efficient, is that it can stop firms from assembling too much political or cultural power. It can also help screen out real externalities. Why is that? Well, it's quite similar to the logic we talked about for screening and willingness to pay earlier. That is, if a new firm comes into the industry and it knows that it's going to have to compete really intensely if its products are substitutable with other products, right? Then it's not going to want to enter an industry where it's got a product that's very close to other firms, because then it's not going to make much profits. It's going to want to enter an industry where it's very far away. So imagine that McDonald's were already in Colombia. You're not going to want to come in and be Burger King if you don't have the chance to collude a little bit with McDonald's or to get acquired by McDonald's, because the competition is going to be so intense that you're going to reduce your prices. Instead, you're going to want to be something a little bit different, like KFC, right? Because they could make profits even if McDonald's is already in the market, because they have pretty different products, right? So, and we learned earlier, right, that we don't want firms to enter an industry where they're very close to the firms that already exist, because then they're going to cause a bunch of negative real externalities and create much less consumer surplus. So one reason for having competition policy, I think actually the main reason for having competition policy, is that it discourages firms from entering industries where they're very similar to the firms that are already in the industry. Another reason you might want competition policy is otherwise firms might get too big to fail, right? And that we saw the consequences of that during the financial crisis. On the other hand, there are some major downsides. So one is the cream skimming from adverse selection that we just talked about. If that's a real big problem, if firms designing their products and changing what their products are like to try to get the most valuable consumers is a real problem, then competition is not so valuable. Competition can also inhibit economies of scale or the profits from innovation, as we talked about last class. It can also inhibit firms' ability to coordinate when there are complementarities between their products, and we'll talk about that on Monday. Another reason that I think is less important why many people oppose competition policy is they say, look, most times when firms form a cartel or when there's collusion, some other firm will pretty soon come into the industry and break up that cartel, and that'll solve the problem. I don't think that that's so correct for 2 reasons. One is that it may take a while for that to happen. And second, that other firm coming into the industry may have costs, right? And that may be exactly what we want to avoid, is firms having to pay the cost of entry to break up existing collusive agreements or to join the collusive agreements. So Now, usually, competition policy doesn't think about any of the issues that I just listed. It just thinks about the static distortions that are created by market power. So I'm going to focus on that for the rest of the lecture pretty much, but keep in mind that there's all these other trade-offs in competition policy, and there's lots of work to be done on trying to incorporate those. Okay, so what is antitrust policy? Well, in the United States, it has two bases. One is the Sherman Antitrust Act, which makes it illegal to have cartels, and the Clayton Antitrust Act, which makes it illegal to merge in a way that would reduce competition. Okay. Now, why might we not want to block all mergers from taking place? Yeah, Oscar.
By merging, you have a chance to achieve higher economies of scale.
Yeah.
Because of the efficiency that you can create.
Yeah. Or to deal with the complementarities or reduce cream skimming, things like that, right? But the most common one is quote-unquote economies of scale, right? So the growing size of the AT&T network in the United States recently. So the AT&T tried to acquire one of its rivals recently in the United States, T-Mobile. In the end, they didn't get to. The Justice Department blocked it. But the argument they made was that, look, it doesn't make any sense to have these two networks. If you put together, we would have much better coverage over the country if we could use both of our towers, right? So that might have been efficient, right? So agencies have to weigh this against the anti-competitive effects. Now, there are tons of agencies actually in the United States that have something to do with competition policy, but there are two main agencies that are in charge of most things. And does anyone know what those two agencies are? So it's the United States Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. So the Department of Justice, which is in charge of all criminal enforcement, has an antitrust division that's in charge of antitrust policy. And then there's the Federal Trade Commission. Now, merging companies have to pre-notify these agencies if they're planning to merge. And then the agencies have the right under the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act to subpoena data in many stages. So first, they just look at the submission by the firms, and most mergers are just allowed to go through. Then they take a closer look for about a month at about maybe 10% of the cases. And then they say, OK, 90% of these are fine, but 10% of these we really want to look at more carefully. We want you to give us all of your data so we can do a comprehensive analysis. And they have a team of about 150 PhD economists between the two of them, all educated at very top places in the United States, who analyze these data and try to figure out if the effect of the merger is going to be too anti-competitive. Now, most mergers survive this process in the end. As I said, they say 90% are OK, 10% go to a second review. In second review, maybe about 50% of them end up being OK. About 40% of them, they find a way to make the merger work by having the firm do something other than just give up the whole merger. So they make them, sell some of the parts of the business that are most competing or change it in some way. Then you're left with about 1% of all mergers that they want to say, no, that's not going to go through. And in that 1%, about 90% of that 1%, they say to the company, look, you can't merge. And the company says, OK, fine. In about 0.1% of all mergers, they go to court, and they fight it out in court. OK. Now, this process is one of the most sophisticated, if not the most sophisticated form of economic regulation in the world. Basically, you've got this huge team of very well-educated economists doing all this quantitative analysis, basically like writing papers to figure out what to do. And this has been copied all over the world. So the European Commission, which didn't used to have any merger policy, now has a process very similar to the United States. The United Kingdom, similarly, has a very similar process. Australia, New Zealand, other Commonwealth countries. Now, it's more primitive and unstructured in the developing world. So in Peru, for example, there is no law against mergers. In other countries, there is a law against mergers, but the infrastructure for actually evaluating them is much more minimal. There's effectively, in these countries, no real control. Others have a structure, but they don't have as much economic expertise as they would like to have. And Colombia is a good example of that. So Colombia is still working on writing the merger guidelines. Hopefully you guys read the US merger guidelines. Colombia is still trying to write its own merger guidelines and still trying to find a chief economist, still trying to build the basics of these institutions. So maybe one day you guys can help improve Colombian competition policy. A few countries are a bit ahead of where Colombia is, but not still at the level of developing countries. So China, Brazil, Chile have made a lot of progress, have very good institutions, have a good economic staff, but are not quite at the level of a developed country. So it's very heterogeneous across the world. And my view is that just like with market power, heterogeneity means that most of the gains come from improving the worst, not making the best a little bit better. And in fact, you might even waste resources on making the best a little bit better. So almost all of I/O is focused on issues in developed countries. Essentially, 99.9% of I/O is about that. And yet I think 99.9% of the benefits from improving industrial economics, improving competition policy, comes in developing countries. So I hope, given that you guys are from Colombia, you'll think about the possibility, if you get interested in industrial economics, of really trying to improve competition policies in the developing world. Okay, so the traditional way that mergers used to be analyzed was on the basis of what was called industry concentration. So you would treat the entire industry basically as a single product. How would you do that? Does anyone read the guidelines and remember what's the process for coming up with the product that you called the industry? Well, there's this process called market definition. And what happened in market definition is you try to define the boundaries of what was included in this product. So you would start with the two merging products, and then you would add the closest substitutes for each of those products. So you would say, imagine that, Coke and Pepsi are going to merge. What is the relevant market? Is it all drinks? Should we include wine producers in the market or not? Is it all soft drinks? Should we include juice producers in the market? Etc. You know what I mean? So you would think about what are the closest things to the product. So it might be fizzy beverages. Maybe all the fizzy beverages should be together, right? And you start adding products until you get to the point, and closeness is defined based on both on how similar the products are and on the geographic boundaries. So if you were thinking about a merger between someone who produces, who's a restaurant, Chinese restaurant in Bogota, a merger between them and a Chinese restaurant in Cali might not be so bad because those firms aren't competing so much. The closest substitute for a Chinese restaurant in Bogota is probably going to be a Chinese restaurant in the neighboring city or in a different neighborhood of Bogota or something like that, right? And what you would do is you would stop and you would call an industry a market once you got to a set of products where if someone were to control all those products, they would have an incentive to raise prices by at least 5% for at least 1 year. That is called the hypothetical monopolist test. If you had a monopoly over these things, you'd have an incentive to raise prices by 5% for 1 year. And where did 5% for 1 year come from? Well, the Supreme Court in the United States said that this would be a market if a hypothetical monopolist would have an incentive to introduce a small but significant and non-transitory increase in price. And the agencies had to say, what the hell does small but significant and non-transitory mean? Well, they decided it means 5% for 1 year. Okay. So once you define the industry, you had to measure the concentration of the industry. And what's the typical way that we measure concentration of industry? Can anyone tell me? Yeah, Tatiana. Oh, sorry, no, Nancy. Sorry. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. So this is called the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. And as Nancy said, you take the share of each firm, which is the quantity that they sell divided by the total quantity, and you sum it up across all firms. And then you usually multiply not by 1,000, but by 10,000. That's the standard thing that you do. And one way to think about this is that 1 divided by H is sort of like the approximate number of firms. If you had 5 firms and each of them had equal market share, then H would be 1/5. And so 1 over H would be approximately 5, right? So from what we saw before, 3 to 5 firms is the level where it starts to get dangerous, where you start to get anti-competitive effects from the study by Bresnahan and Race, right? This is also closely related to the collusion problem, and Stigler made a relationship to there, and to market performance under Cournot. So under Cournot, remember that price minus marginal cost is equal to the slope of price times the quantity, right? So another way of putting that is it's equal to price over the elasticity times the share of the firm. So it turns out, before I had that 1 over n was equal to theta. If firms are not all the same, basically theta is equal to the Herfindahl index, you can show. So Herfindahl index is a natural measure of the degree of competitiveness. Now the standard analysis was that if H is above 1800, then the merger is definitely going to be problematic if the industry is that concentrated. On the other hand, if it's above 1800 and it raises the Herfindahl by at least 300, then we should be worried about this merger. Now, that corresponds to the high end of this range. So a lot of people think, based on the Bresnahan and Race study, it would be OK to permit more concentration than this, closer to 3,300. But the standard was very conservative, and so they said it's above 1,800. OK. Now, unfortunately, this approach has proved very cumbersome in the real world. And the reason is that it requires that we say every product is either in the market or out of the market. But we know that in reality, some products are more similar to others than others are, right? You wouldn't have to go through the whole market definition process if that were the case, right? Second, it's not completely clear that the concentration is necessarily the relevant thing. How substitutable the products are might be the relevant thing. I mean, there's many things like that, right? And in fact, remember that in Cournot, the best mergers are the ones between a really big firm and a smaller firm, which might increase the concentration significantly. So the new merger guidelines that were issued 2 years ago now, and that I was quite involved in the writing of, and are now the official policy in the US. Also, they issued new ones in the UK at the same time. Really changed the way that merger policy was conducted. The 1992 merger guidelines, which were the last ones before these, were all based on Herfindahl indices and market definition. Whereas the new ones emphasize, not logic above, we're going to talk about the logic in 1 minute, the differentiated product industry. So rather than assuming that there's just like one product, it explicitly takes into account the fact that there are many different products, right? So these were designed by 2 economists, Carl Shapiro and Joe Farrell, who are the creators of upward pricing pressure, which I'll talk about in just 1 minute. So the progress on improving these guidelines is ongoing, and it may come to reflect more of the types of reasoning that we've been talking about and that we'll talk more about during this lecture. And for example, there was a report recently in the United Kingdom which emphasized the importance of conjectural variations and trying to bring that into analysis. But that's not going to be included in the simple version that I'm going to tell you right now. OK, so let's look at the approach from these reforms. The idea is that competition is usually between firms that have differentiated products. And therefore, a merger doesn't usually eliminate products. It just consolidates the ownership of the products. Competition can help in this case, and a merger can be harmful because of the incentive that firms will have to increase prices when they merge. Now, why would they increase prices when they merge? Well, let's think about the case where there's just two firms. And let's just ignore what's going on with the other firms. Not that there aren't other firms in the world, but remember in a monopoly model, we thought just about one firm. Here we're going to think just about two firms, because that's the cleanest way in which we can think about the merger between two firms, right? OK, so imagine that each firm has a quantity which depends on the price of both of the firms. And let's assume that they compete differentiated products, Nash and prices, like we talked about before. So the profits the firm earns are going to be price times quantity minus cost, right? And let's denote the partial derivatives of quantity with respect to the first price and the second price, that is, with respect to my own price and the other price, by QI1 and QI2. Now, the first order condition is going to be just like we did before, given by here. If we let the marginal cost be the derivative of cost with respect to quantity, we get that each firm sets price equal to marginal cost plus quantity divided by the negative of the derivative of quantity with respect to my own price. That's the same as this elasticity, residual elasticity that we talked about before, right? So, or in other words, price is equal to marginal cost plus the Cournot distortion. But now, if the firms merge together, they're going to maximize the sum of the profits on the two products. Price times quantity 1, price times quantity 2, plus cost of the two firms, right? And the first order condition for them is now going to be this here. It's going to be quantity of the first good plus markup on the first good times the derivative of quantity with respect to price plus markup on the second good times the derivative of the second good's product's quantity with respect to the first product's price. Yeah, sorry. That's right. Sorry. Good point. OK, so we're now going to divide, as we did here, by the derivative of each product's by the derivative of the first product's price with respect to its own price, and we get this expression here. OK, so the first two terms on the right-hand side are just marginal cost and the Cournot distortion. What's this term here? This term is sort of the externality on the other firm that we talked about from before. It's the markup of the other firm times the diversion ratio that we talked about before. When I sell a good, what fraction of the sales are taken from the other firm? Right? OK. So the change that occurred as a result of the merger is not this part. That already existed. The change that occurred as a result of this part of the merger is this expression. So again, it is two parts. It's the markup on my partner's product times the diversion ratio, right? And this is called the upward pricing pressure from product 1 to product 2. Now, this is always going to be positive if the products are substitutes. Because if the products are substitutes, every time I sell a good, there's going to be less goods sold by my partner, right? So it basically says, if Burger King sells an additional product, how many sales is McDonald's going to lose, right? If Burger King merges with McDonald's, Burger King is now going to internalize the profits that McDonald's lost, the markup times the lost sales. And this is exactly what UPP is. If you think about it, this is basically an additional opportunity cost of me making a sale, which is created by the merger taking place, right? Because now every time I sell a burger, I have to think about the fact that my merger partner is going to lose some profits on that. And like any other cost, this gets passed through to prices, right? So this says that all else being equal, a merger between competitors is going to raise prices. So this gives us a basic flavor of what the effect in a differentiated products industry of a merger will be. But remember that we left out of this a bunch of things that we've been talking about so far. So one is that other firms in the industry, there are other firms than these two firms in the industry, and the firms may have conjectures about what the other firms are going to do. They may not take their prices as given, right? So adding these features in is relatively simple given everything that we've already talked about, and that's exactly what I'm going to try to do in the rest of the lecture. Okay, so we can define my residual demand curve taking into account the conjectures of all firms, just like we did earlier in the lecture. In terms of quantities, now we're doing it in terms of prices. So the derivative of my demand with respect to my price is now the partial derivative of my demand with respect to my price, plus the sum over all the other firms of the partial derivative of my demand with respect to their price times how much I think their price changes when my price changes from conjectures. So again, the pre-merger equilibrium is just going to be my price is equal to marginal cost plus this plus the negative, that's negative down there, sorry. Price is equal to marginal cost plus my markup, the Cournot distortion on this residual inverse demand, on this residual demand curve. After the merger, on the other hand, we want to hold fixed the price of the firm that I'm merging with, right? Because once I've merged, by the envelope theorem, I don't care whether that firm changes its prices or not, so I can hold them fixed. So, because I've chosen them optimally. So, before I was taking into account a conjecture, but now I'm holding fixed the prices of the other firms, right? So, if firms I and J merge, we can define a notion of their derivative of their quantity with respect to the price, which holds fixed the price of the firm that I'm merging with. Now I'm going to skip messy math associated with that, but basically we get exactly the same thing that we had before, except now the Cournot distortion that I care about holds fixed the price of the other firm rather than taking into account its reactions. And again, I have this UPP term, the markup times the diversion ratio. But again, it's a diversion ratio holding fixed the price of my merger partner, whereas before I was allowing him to react according to this. Okay, so there are now going to be two differences relative to the UPP formula that we looked at before. Gabrielle, what are those two differences? Okay, anyone else want to try to explain the two differences? Well, okay, so there's two things. First of all, the diversion ratio that we're using here to compute the UPP is different than before. But it's holding fixed my merger partner's price, which was the same as before, but allowing all the other prices of firms in the industry to adjust, right? Second, the elasticity that I take into account is now different, right? And so there's been a change in my elasticity of demand as a result of holding fixed my merger partner's price rather than letting it vary. Okay. So these, the interesting thing about this is introducing conjectural variations actually has offsetting effects on how big this is going to be. Because on the one hand, the diversion ratio gets bigger when there's more conjectures. Why is that? When I think that when I raise my price, other people will cooperate with me and raise their prices. Why is that? Because if when I'm merged, I hold fixed the price of my merger partner, when I raise my price, two things are going to change when there's conjectures. If other firms other than my merger partner increase their price, that's going to reduce the number of sales I lose, but increase the number of sales that my merger partner gains. Why is that? Well, all the other firms are raising their prices when I raise my price. So I don't lose as many sales. And because they all raise their prices, my merger partner is gaining more. So that diversion ratio, how many does my partner gain for every one that I lose, is going to go up. That's going to make the UPP greater, right? That's going to make this term bigger. On the other hand, if now rather than my merger partner accommodating me, I hold his price fixed, that's going to make my demand more elastic. Because when he was raising his price to accommodate me, right, that meant that I lost fewer sales. So that's going to lead to an offsetting term here. The bigger conjectures are, the bigger this term is, but also the bigger is this offsetting term. So what that suggests is that at least in some cases, even though introducing conjectures changes this formula, it might not change it too much because there are these two offsetting effects. It depends on how much more closely I'm coordinating with the person I'm thinking about merging with than with other people in the industry. If I'm coordinating more with the person I'm merging with, then it's not so bad that we merge because we're already sort of coordinating with each other. If I'm coordinating with other people in the industry, then it could be really bad that we merge because that's going to make the diversion ratio greater. Okay. So how can we measure all these things? Well, one way is we can get documents from the companies. You can subpoena documents from the companies, and this might tell you what they think the diversion ratio is. They might say that somewhere, right? Because companies have to think about these things. They have to think about who their closest competitor is so they can compete well against them. Surveys or internet data are another promising way. So you can have a survey where you ask consumers, if you hadn't bought this product, which other product would you have bought? Now, we know that surveys can be really problematic for reasons we talked about in the externality lecture. But here, at least the survey is asking about something a bit more concrete that consumers might have a better sense for, right? That doesn't mean they won't lie because they might be against or in favor of the merger and they might know what's going on, but at least it's not quite as nebulous, right? Even better is data from online. So if you go on Amazon and you look at a product, they'll say people who bought this product also bought this product, or people who thought about buying this product also bought that product. That will often tell you when products are close substitutes for one another. So a really exciting frontier, which people have just started to use, is this sort of online data. Another thing you can do is what are called win-loss studies from auctions. So if the market that people are competing in is, in an auction market, you can say, when this person won, who was most often the second highest bidder, right? Another thing you can do is a bunch of econometrics. And there's a whole industry of really fancy things you can do to try to estimate demand when you don't really have clear shifters in costs. Whether you believe that that actually works or not, I don't know, but it's a big industry. The problem, I think, with trying to do this stuff, the reason why it gets so complicated is if you have Nash and Price's competition, you need to have a cost shifter for every firm in the industry. Because the problem is that when one firm's cost goes up, other firms are going to change their prices. But Nash and Price's competition says that I think that all the other firms are holding fixed their prices when my cost changes. That makes it really hard to measure these things. So a place where it's easier is if you assume consistent conjectures, you don't have to worry about that. Why? Because I'm assuming that the conjecture that firms have, the residual demand they care about, is that when their cost increases and their price increases, the way that all other firms change their prices is taken into account in their optimal price. So if you have consistent conjectures, all you need is the cost shocks to the two firms in the industry, because their residual demand is the thing that's going to matter. Okay. So now what we've talked about so far is just the opportunity cost that's created by the merger, right? But the opportunity cost created by the merger doesn't really tell you how much the prices change. To translate a change in opportunity cost into a change in price, we have to multiply by a pass-through rate. There's only two small complications here, which is that when two firms merge, that pushes up the prices of both of those two merging firms, not just one of them. And it may affect the optimal prices for the other firms. So when the costs of these two firms go up, they both go up at the same time, and those changes in their cost may affect other firms' optimal costs. So the way that you deal with this is, rather than having a pass-through, as we've been talking about, you have a matrix of pass-through rates, which says that as each firm's cost goes up, how do the prices of all the other firms in the industry change? And each element of this says, what's the effect of one cost on other firms' costs? So then if G is the vector of the generalized pricing pressures that we got from this equation here, we can then multiply those generalized pricing pressures by the pass-through rate. And that is going to give us the change in prices, right? You don't really need to follow all these matrices unless you're actually going to go into competition policy. But basically, the idea here is the pass-through is used to convert changes in these generalized pricing pressure into changes in actual prices, right? Okay. So the next question to ask is, how do these changes in prices actually affect consumer welfare? So social welfare. Now, in competition policy, people usually just focus on consumer welfare. That's what leads them to neglect all the stuff that we've been talking about and just focus on static distortions. But let's just follow blindly down that path. So as always, we can always use the envelope theorem to get consumer surplus from the changes in price, right? Because we know that the change in price times quantity is how much consumer surplus changes, right? And the quantities are very easy to measure. We can just collect data on those usually from the market very easily. This is the same principle as constructing a price index, right? So when people talk about inflation, what they do is they do the change in the prices times the quantities, right? That tells them how much overall prices have increased. And you can do the same thing here. So you can do this change in consumer surplus divided by prices times quantities, which gives you sort of the percentage change in the price index facing consumers. Now, Nancy, how would we do this for social surplus? What's the formula for the change in consumer surplus is delta P times Q. What's the formula for the change in social surplus? Any thoughts? What did we say when the quantities changes? How much does the social surplus change? Remember? Does anyone else remember? How much does social surplus change when the quantities change? No? Well, remember, it was the change in quantity times the markup, right? The change in social welfare is the change in all the quantities times the markups. So if we have the markups, which we needed to estimate to get the UPP, or the JEEP, we can then multiply all this by dq dp to get the changes in quantities, and then multiply it by markups to get the change in social welfare, right? Okay. So all this stuff is basically the same as doing comparative statics in a monopoly, right? It's just that we have this vector of variables. But we talked about doing comparative statics with vectors of variables. The benefit of putting things into this normative form, rather than just talking about changes in prices, or even what UPP does, just your incentive to change prices, is that we can incorporate all the other types of effects that we've been talking about before and weigh them off against the harms of a merger. So we can talk about the effects on cream skimming. We can talk about all those other things, and we can add them in to the total effect on social surplus, right? Things that, like the Spence distortion, things like the cream skimming, none of that has really been done. Even just getting to a formula like this, where you take into account just the price effects, is still a working paper. Incorporating all these other effects of competition to trade them off is something that is yet to be done. So I think there's a lot of exciting stuff to do on competition policy. And I think I can wrap up there. And I have office hours now. So if anyone wants to come to office hours, you can just walk back with me.